Before Jefferson Dauda became a name that commanded silence in the most exclusive boardrooms of Lagos, before the tailored Italian suits, the custom-built penthouse overlooking the Atlantic, and the relentless ambition that transformed him into one of Nigeria's youngest billionaires, he was a ghost, haunting his own life. At 30 years old, Jefferson was the definition of power and isolation. He moved through his perfectly curated world like a machine, his interactions driven by strategic necessity rather than human connection. He was a man who had built an empire from the wreckage of a tragedy nobody knew about, a tragedy that had effectively severed him from his own heart years ago. Every day was a performance of invulnerability. He was the cold, calculating CEO of Dauda Industries, a figure revered and feared in equal measure. But when the office emptied and the city lights blurred outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, Jefferson was just a man drowning in silence, perpetually defined by the echoes of a devastating loss he couldn't outrun. He had everything money could buy, yet he owned nothing that truly mattered, especially the love he had carelessly abandoned years ago. On the other side of this vast emotional and social chasm was Nancy Opara. At 27, Nancy was a woman built on resilience and carefully constructed armor. She lived a comfortable, upper-middle-class life in Lagos, but it was a life forged in the fire of severe heartbreak and humiliation. Years ago, she had been a vibrant, hopeful girl who believed in the promises of a boy who was everything to her. She believed in the hundreds of handwritten letters, the daily check-ins, the profound connection that seemed to defy the distance between Enugu and Lagos. She had given him her full trust, her dreams, and ultimately, her heart. In turn, he had left her standing alone in a crowded airport, an 18-year-old girl with 2 suitcases, and a soul that had just been shattered into countless pieces. The pain of that abandonment hadn't just broken her heart, it had fundamentally rewritten her operating system. The open, trusting girl she had been died that day, replaced by a guarded woman who viewed vulnerability as a dangerous weakness. Nancy was successful, intelligent, and focused, but she was also incredibly cautious. She kept people at a distance, preferring the safety of solitude to the unpredictable chaos of intimacy. She had rebuilt her life brick by excruciating brick, determined to never again depend on anyone for her happiness or sense of worth. She had forced herself to forget him, or at least, she told herself she had. The contrast between them was absolute. Jefferson was a man who owned the city, a billionaire defining industries, yet emotionally bankrupt. Nancy was a hard-working professional, emotionally self-sufficient, but living a much more modest reality. He was the apex predator in the corporate jungle. She was a focused professional navigating the system. The only thing they shared was a past that was carefully locked away, a past that neither of them had truly resolved. Jefferson's greatest secret was the immense guilt and grief he carried, a secret that made him fear ever connecting with another human being. Nancy's greatest secret was the lingering ache of a love that still defined her, a secret that made her fear ever being vulnerable again. Their worlds were light years apart, 2 distinct trajectories that should never have intersected again. Jefferson continued to dominate the economic landscape of Nigeria, his name synonymous with success and ruthless efficiency, while Nancy built a steady, respectable career, far removed from the headlines and high-stakes games of the elite. But life has a twisted sense of humor and an infinite capacity for irony. Destiny was quietly setting the stage for an explosive reunion, preparing to collide these 2 wounded souls in the most unexpected and dramatic way possible. Nancy was about to walk into an interview for her dream job, a position that promised to elevate her career to the next level, totally unaware that the man she had loved and loathed for nearly a decade was waiting on the other side of those massive, polished office doors, about to shatter her carefully constructed peace all over again. The heavy glass doors of the executive suite on Victoria Island swung open with a muted, expensive click, and Nancy stepped forward, her heels tapping a confident rhythm against the polished marble floor. She adjusted the lapel of her tailored blazer, taking a deep breath to steady the sudden, inexplicable flutter in her chest. This interview was supposed to be the coronation of her hard work, the final step into a secure and prosperous future. The receptionist gave a polite, deferential nod and stepped aside, allowing Nancy to enter the inner sanctum of Dauda Industries. She looked up, a professional smile ready on her lips, but the words died instantly in her throat. The air left her lungs as if she had been physically struck. Sitting behind a massive desk of dark, polished mahogany was a man whose silhouette was permanently burned into her memory. It was him, Jefferson Dauda. He had changed. The soft lines of his teenage face had hardened into sharp, aristocratic angles, and the messy curls she once loved were perfectly styled. He wore a charcoal black Italian suit that screamed unimaginable wealth, and an air of absolute authority surrounded him like an impenetrable shield. For a fraction of a second, as his eyes met hers, the cold, calculated mask of the billionaire CEO cracked. His pen froze midair, and a look of profound, agonizing shock flashed across his face, as if he were staring at a ghost he had spent a lifetime mourning. Nancy felt the floor beneath her sway. The corporate office vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of a 7-year-old memory, the suffocating heat of the airport, the burning humiliation of staring at the entrance doors for hours, and the agonizing realization that she had been abandoned. The anger she had buried so deeply surged to the surface, hot and volatile. She wanted to turn and walk out, to flee the presence of the man who had rewritten her life with his cruelty. But her pride anchored her to the spot. She refused to let him see her run. Before either of them could speak, the heavy silence was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Operations Officer Marcus Vance, a man known for his ruthless corporate politics and blatant arrogance. Marcus swept into the room, entirely blind to the electric tension vibrating between the CEO and the candidate. He dropped a thick portfolio onto the desk, casting a dismissive, patronizing glance at Nancy. Marcus had his own agenda. He wanted his unqualified nephew hired for the position, and Nancy's stellar credentials were a direct threat to his nepotistic plans. He immediately began undermining her, highlighting her roots in Enugu as a sign of provincial inadequacy, his voice dripping with condescension. Jefferson sat entirely motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched violently in his cheek, his dark eyes locked onto Nancy with an intensity that felt almost suffocating. He didn't defend her, nor did he interrupt Marcus's arrogant tirade. To Nancy, his silence felt like the ultimate betrayal, a repetition of the airport abandonment. She stood there, enduring the passive-aggressive insults of an antagonist who saw her as nothing more than a social inferior, while her former love watched in total silence. The injustice was staggering, a bitter pill that tasted of old wounds and current social inequality. Yet Nancy refused to break. She held her head high, answering Marcus's hostile technical questions with flawless precision, her voice steady and her mind sharp, proving her worth even as the system sought to diminish her. When the grueling interview finally ended, Marcus dismissively told her they would be in touch, a smirk playing on his lips. Nancy turned and walked out of the room, her dignity intact but her heart bleeding. She expected to receive a cold rejection letter by evening, a final insult from a past that refused to stay buried. Instead, the very next morning, a formal contract arrived via courier, offering her the position with a salary that was double the industry standard. It was an offer she couldn't afford to refuse, a golden cage that drew her right into the dragon's den. Working at Dauda Industries quickly became a psychological battlefield. Nancy tried to maintain absolute distance, throwing herself into her work and ignoring the powerful shadow that governed the building. But Jefferson made avoidance impossible. He was constantly there, silent, brooding presence. He demanded her presence in high-level meetings, his eyes tracking her every movement with a desperate, possessive intensity. The corporate hierarchy began to notice, and none more so than Marcus Vance, who grew furious that his authority was being bypassed. Marcus began a covert campaign to make Nancy's life a living hell, overloading her with impossible deadlines and subtly turning other staff members against her, framing her as an overnight favorite who hadn't earned her place. Through it all, the most agonizing part for Nancy was Jefferson's behavior. He wouldn't leave her alone, yet he wouldn't explain himself. He would call her into his office under the guise of reviewing financial reports, only to sit in a heavy, suffocating silence, just looking at her as if he wanted to scream 1,000 secrets, but was physically choked by his own pride. Nancy's resentment grew with every passing day. Why was he doing this? He didn't want her 7 years ago. He had thrown her love into the dirt without a single word of explanation. Why was he torturing her now? The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when Caleb, a kind and genuinely friendly coworker from accounting, walked up to Nancy's desk with a warm smile and a cup of coffee. Caleb was everything Jefferson wasn't: approachable, light-hearted, and completely unburdened by dark emotional baggage. He sat on the edge of her desk, making a light joke about Marcus's latest corporate memo, and for the first time in weeks, Nancy let out a genuine, unburdened laugh. It was a beautiful, human moment in a sterile, hostile environment. But the laughter was abruptly cut short. A shadow fell over the desk, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop to freezing. Jefferson stood there, his hands buried deep in his trouser pockets, his gaze fixed on Caleb with a chilling, predatory focus. The possessiveness radiating from the billionaire was terrifying. His chest rose and fell in heavy, controlled breaths, and the absolute hatred in his eyes for a simple accountant was unmistakable. Caleb scrambled to his feet, the smile vanishing from his face as he felt the sheer weight of the CEO's wrath. Jefferson didn't raise his voice, but his words were sharp as glass as he dismissed Caleb, commanding Nancy to follow him upstairs immediately. The sheer injustice of his jealousy exploded inside Nancy's chest. He had no right to dictate her joy, no right to police her smiles, and no right to pretend he cared, not after what he did. As she walked into his private elevator, the trap was set, the tension wound up to its absolute limit, and the storm of 7 years of unexpressed agony was finally ready to break. The private elevator rode up to the penthouse executive floor in a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like the calm before a devastating storm. Inside his expansive corner office, the moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, Nancy snapped, unleashing 7 years of suppressed anger, humiliation, and bitter resentment. She demanded to know by what right he assumed ownership over her social interactions, pointing out the hypocrisy of his suffocating jealousy after he had discarded her like absolute garbage at an airport terminal 7 years ago. Jefferson stood by the glass windows, his back turned, his shoulders rigid under his expensive suit jacket as her words cut through his carefully constructed corporate armor. When he finally turned around, the cold, untouchable billionaire persona was entirely gone, replaced by a man looking utterly hollowed out by pain. His jaw worked silently before he confessed, in a voice rough and fractured with emotion, that leaving her had destroyed his life just as thoroughly as it had broken hers. He stepped closer, his dark eyes wide and pleading, asking her if she truly believed there had been a single day, a single hour, where he had forgotten her face or the love they had shared. The raw vulnerability in his admission sent a tremor through Nancy's defenses, but her mind fiercely guarded her wounded pride, refusing to let his sudden emotional display erase years of agony. The confrontation left an invisible, highly charged static between them in the days that followed, transforming the corporate office into a psychological pressure cooker. Seizing upon this volatile atmosphere, Marcus Vance decided to escalate his hostile campaign to ruin Nancy once and for all. Discovering that Nancy had been given access to the highly confidential financial portfolios for the upcoming multi-billion naira expansion project, Marcus orchestrated a malicious frame-up. Late at night, using a duplicate keycard, Marcus entered the archives, downloaded the proprietary data onto an untraceable external drive, and leaked the sensitive information directly to their primary corporate competitors. He then meticulously altered the digital access logs to ensure the entire digital footprint pointed squarely to Nancy's personal employee credentials. By the following Monday morning, the leak hit the financial news headlines, plunging Dauda Industries into a massive public relations and economic crisis. Marcus immediately called an emergency board meeting, publicly accusing Nancy of corporate espionage and breach of trust, demanding not only her immediate termination but her public arrest and prosecution. He stood at the end of the boardroom table, a smug, villainous grin playing on his lips as he presented the fabricated digital evidence to the board members, fully expecting Jefferson to throw her to the wolves to save the company's reputation. The atmosphere in the boardroom was toxic with judgment, and Nancy felt a terrifying sense of déjà vu as the world once again prepared to condemn her unfairly. But instead of authorizing her arrest, Jefferson stood up, silencing the chaotic room with a single thunderous slam of his hand on the table. To Marcus's absolute fury, Jefferson flatly refused to terminate Nancy, stating with absolute certainty that a full internal investigation would be conducted by his personal security detail before any blame was assigned. This fierce, protective intervention only deepened the intrigue and fueled the toxic rumors circulating through the company corridors, painting Nancy as a manipulative seductress, holding a mysterious power over the CEO. Nancy felt completely trapped in a web of corporate deceit and emotional turmoil, her professional reputation hanging by a thread while the real villain celebrated a premature victory. The unbearable tension reached a breaking point on the night of the annual company gala, hosted at an opulent luxury hotel in Victoria Island, amidst one of the most violent rainstorms Lagos had seen in a decade. As thunder rattled the massive glass windows of the ballroom, Nancy moved through the crowd of wealthy elites, looking like an absolute vision in a fitted emerald green gown, though her heart was heavy with anxiety. Jefferson stayed glued to her side the entire evening, guiding her through interactions with high-profile investors with a quiet, unyielding possessiveness that left no room for interpretation. Despite the elegant music and flowing champagne, Nancy could feel the heavy, dark distraction weighing on Jefferson, whose eyes repeatedly drifted to his encrypted phone as the storm outside worsened. By midnight, flash floods completely paralyzed the roads across Victoria Island, trapping the guests and forcing a sudden change of plans. Jefferson bypassed the flooded city routes, navigating his luxury vehicle through the torrential downpour directly toward his private, highly secured penthouse in the exclusive enclave of Banana Island. Upon entering the massive, minimalist apartment, the sheer isolation of the space amplified the unresolved history vibrating between them. While Jefferson stepped into an adjoining room to take an urgent, hushed phone call from his head of security regarding the leak investigation, Nancy wandered down the dimly lit hallway, guided by an innate, irresistible curiosity. She stepped into his private study, a room that felt completely different from the rest of the cold, modern penthouse, filled with old vinyl records, shelves of worn books, and a deep, melancholic atmosphere that reminded her instantly of the boy from Obudu. Her eyes caught a heavy wooden box partially hidden beneath the dark mahogany desk, its brass lock slightly askew and unclicked. Heart pounding against her ribs, Nancy crouched down and pulled the lid open, expecting perhaps to find corporate secrets or relics of his wealthy lifestyle. Instead, her breath caught in her throat as she uncovered a meticulously preserved archive of absolute tragedy, old newspaper clippings, police incident reports, medical certificates, and hospital logs from 7 years ago. At the very top lay a faded photograph of a teenage Jefferson standing shoulder to shoulder with a younger, fiercely grinning boy who shared his exact eyes. Nancy picked up a certified document underneath the photo, her hands shaking violently as her eyes scanned the cold, bureaucratic text of a death certificate. The name read Jordan Dowda, age 17, and the date of demise was the exact identical date of the morning she had been left abandoned and broken-hearted at the airport, waiting for a boy who never showed up. The fragile paper of the death certificate rattled against Nancy's trembling fingers as a deafening crack of thunder shook the entire penthouse, illuminating the dark study in a harsh, ghostly white light. The devastating truth crashed over her consciousness like a tidal wave, physically stealing the air from her lungs as she stared at the official stamp, confirming the sudden death of 17-year-old Jordan Dowda. 7 years of burning hatred, deep-seated humiliation, and agonizing self-doubt dissolved into a profound, suffocating sorrow. Jefferson had not grown bored of her. He had not maliciously abandoned her to laugh with his wealthy friends in Lagos. His entire world had been violently ripped apart at the exact moment she was pacing the airport terminal. A soft, weary sound from the doorway caused her to gasp, and she looked up through a sudden veil of hot tears to find Jefferson standing completely still, watching her. The cold, impenetrable armor of the billionaire CEO had entirely melted away, leaving behind the shattered, vulnerable boy from Obudu Mountain Resort, looking thoroughly hollowed out by a lifetime of carried grief. He did not yell at her for violating his privacy, nor did he rush to close the box. He simply closed his eyes, letting out a fractured, ragged breath that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Walking slowly into the room, his knees almost buckling under the invisible weight of the memory, he sank onto the edge of the desk and finally broke the silence that had stretched between them for nearly a decade. In a low, raw voice, he confessed the dark secret that had fueled his ruthless ambition and his complete emotional isolation on the very eve of his planned departure to pick her up from Enugu. He and his younger brother Jordan had entered into a stupid, volatile argument over something entirely meaningless. Jordan, in a fit of teenage rebellion, had snatched Jefferson's car keys and sped off into the treacherous rain-slicked Lagos night, and Jefferson, paralyzed by a stubborn pride he would regret for the rest of his days, had deliberately ignored his brother's frantic, incoming phone calls an hour later. The next call had been from the police, delivering the catastrophic news that Jordan's car had spun out of control on the Third Mainland Bridge, killing him instantly. Jefferson described the total, systemic collapse of his family in the hours that followed, his mother slowly descending into a catatonic state of shock, his powerful father suffering a near-fatal stroke from the grief, Jefferson himself completely drowning in a suffocating, paralyzing pool of survivor's guilt. He wept openly now, the tears streaming down his aristocratic face as he admitted that he had arrived at the airport terminal hours late, a hollowed-out shell of a human being who couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, and felt so fundamentally toxic that he believed staying away from Nancy was the only way to protect her from the absolute disaster his life had become. Nancy stood up, her own tears overflowing as the immense injustice of their severed youth hung in the air, realizing that while she was nursing a broken heart, the boy she loved was burying his brother and pulling his family back from the brink of total annihilation. She crossed the small distance between them, her emerald gown brushing against the scattered remnants of his past. And for the first time in 7 long years, she reached out and let her fingers close around his, anchoring him to the present. The profound emotional unmasking, however, was interrupted the very next morning when they returned to the corporate headquarters, where Marcus Vance had prematurely gathered the entire board of directors, along with 2 high-ranking officers from the Nigerian police force, fully prepared to execute his final public execution of Nancy's career. Marcus stood at the head of the boardroom table, his chest puffed out with arrogant triumph, loudly declaring to the assembled stakeholders that Nancy Opara's guilt was absolute and that her immediate, handcuffed arrest was required to salvage the integrity of Dauda Industries. He cast a venomous, patronizing sneer at Nancy as she entered the room beside Jefferson, openly mocking her provincial background and claiming that a girl from Enugu could never comprehend the loyalty required to sit in a Lagos boardroom. But the smug, villainous grin was brutally ripped from Marcus's face when Jefferson did not take his seat at the head of the table. Instead, Jefferson remained standing, a terrifyingly cold, predatory smile spreading across his lips as he signaled his personal cybersecurity detail to take control of the digital presentation screens. The primary monitor flickered to life, displaying not Nancy's alleged digital footprint, but a crystal-clear, high-definition security broadcast from the archive room recorded late the previous Tuesday night, showing Marcus Vance using a stolen administrative keycard, downloading the proprietary expansion data onto an encrypted drive, and subsequently forwarding it to their main competitor's personal email address. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the room as the undeniable evidence of corporate espionage played out in front of the entire board, exposing Marcus as the absolute architect of the leak. Marcus's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray as panic seized his throat. His hands began to shake violently, and he stumbled backward against his chair, trying desperately to construct an apology, stammering that it was an administrative misunderstanding, a joke, a temporary lapse in judgment. Jefferson stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register that vibrated with absolute authority, completely cutting through Marcus's pathetic justifications. He revealed that his security team had been tracking Marcus's financial accounts for months, uncovering millions in covert kickbacks, and that the entire leak had been a calculated trap designed to expose the corruption rotting within the upper management. The 2 police officers stepped forward, the heavy metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the silent boardroom as they tightly bound Marcus's wrists, dragging the shouting, completely humiliated antagonist out of the room in front of the colleagues he had spent years terrorizing. Nancy stood at the center of the room, her head held incredibly high, experiencing a total, triumphant vindication as the board members who had looked down on her just moments prior now stood up, offering profound apologies and a roaring round of applause for her unyielding integrity. Jefferson looked at her across the room, the pride and love in his eyes absolute, proving to the world that justice, though delayed by tragedy and malice, had finally and completely triumphed over the darkness. The swift and brutal fall of Marcus Vance sent shockwaves through the corporate landscape of Lagos, serving as a terrifying reminder that hidden malice always reaps its own destruction. Stripped of his titles, his assets frozen pending an extensive criminal trial for corporate espionage, and his reputation utterly demolished, the former high and mighty executive found himself traded from a lavish office in Victoria Island to a cold, sterile remand cell. There was no wealth, no nepotism, and no family influence capable of buying him out of the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence Jefferson had laid bare. Marcus had sought to weaponize Nancy's social status against her, to exploit her vulnerability and cast her out in disgrace, but instead his own weapon backfired, reducing his life's work to absolute ash. Karma did not merely touch Marcus Vance. It completely uprooted him, leaving him in the very state of isolation and ruin he had so maliciously tried to inflict on an innocent woman. With the dark shadow of corruption purged from the company, Nancy Oprah's life transformed beautifully and permanently, vindicating every ounce of pain she had silently endured. She was formally appointed as the new Chief Operations Officer of Dauda Industries, becoming one of the youngest women to ever hold such a monumental position in the country, respected by her peers, and deeply admired for her unyielding brilliance. But the truest transformation happened far away from the flashing cameras and corporate balance sheets. In the quiet, private moments that followed the storm, the heavy emotional walls that had kept Jefferson and Nancy's locked in separate prisons for 7 years finally crumbled to the ground. They began the slow, delicate process of healing, no longer as the broken teenagers haunted by an airport terminal or a tragic accident, but as two mature souls who had faced the absolute worst of life and chosen to build a bridge over the wreckage. Jefferson learned to breathe again, forgiving himself for a past he could not change, while Nancy allowed her guarded heart to open, realizing that the love she thought had been thrown away was simply waiting for the truth to set it free. The shoeboxes of 101 letters hidden beneath her bed were no longer painful reminders of a ghost. They became the solid foundation of a love story that had successfully survived the test of time, distance, and ultimate tragedy. This deeply moving journey brings us to a profound, unchanging truth about the fragile nature of human relationships and the heavy burdens we choose to carry in secret. Sometimes we convince ourselves that shielding the people we love from our darkest struggles is an act of protection, when in reality it is a form of abandonment that leaves them questioning their own worth. True love and deep connection do not demand perfection, nor do they require you to be completely whole before you allow someone into your life. Rather, they demand absolute transparency. If you truly love someone, and they love you in return, the greatest gift you can offer them is to keep them in the know, allowing them the dignity to stand beside you as a support system through the violent storms of life, instead of shutting them out in the cold. When we bottle up our grief, our guilt, and our fears out of a misplaced sense of pride, we inadvertently build walls that starve our relationships until they completely explode. Let this story be a powerful lesson to everyone listening today. Communication is not just a tool for harmony, it is the absolute lifeline of survival in marriages, friendships, and relationships. Now, to all my beautiful My Chance story lovers, the floor belongs entirely to you, and I want to hear your voices echoing in the section down below. What do you truly think about everything that unfolded between Jefferson and Nancy, and how do you feel about the silent choices they made? If you found yourself standing in Nancy's shoes, discovering that the man who broke your heart was actually drowning in a sea of unspoken family grief, would you have found it within yourself to forgive him and help him heal? Or if you were Jefferson, trapped in the suffocating wreckage of a sibling's sudden tragedy, would you have handled the situation differently, or would you have pushed away the person you loved the most? Please, share your raw thoughts, your deep insights, and your personal experiences in the comments beneath this video, because your perspectives are what make this community so incredibly vibrant. Do not forget to hit that like button, smash the subscribe button, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another captivating, emotionally charged story of life, love, and undeniable karma. Thank you so much for watching. Keep your hearts open, keep the people you love close to your truth, and I will see you in our very next video. Bye for now.